Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody to today's webinar from Business Spectator titled IT Security, What You Must Know in the Mobile Era, brought to you by GoToMeeting and Citrix. I'm James Kirby, Managing Editor of Business Spectator, and I'll be your host today. Now, while we're waiting for the last few people to file into the session, I'll just run through some quick housekeeping. First, to keep the note-taking to a minimum and the interaction to a maximum, we'll be providing you with a link tomorrow to the recording of this live session, so you can listen back to it should you wish. And speaking of interaction, take the opportunity throughout this webinar to write any of our panelists a question. You use the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen to do this. And as always, we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you ask, but it may not be possible to respond to every question in the session, so apologies up front for that. So let's get started. Now, our panelists today, very interesting collection of people in this area. Our first guest is Stephen Wilson. He is the Managing Director of the Lockstep Group. We also have Paul Ducklin, who is the Head of Technology for the Asia Pacific region for Sophos. And we have our own Charis Palmer, who is, of course, the editor of Technology Spectator, which is our new technology website that has just been launched a few weeks ago. And Charis was also the founder of the Online Banking Review. Welcome to everybody. Welcome to you all.
Thanks, James.
Now, you're welcome, and good to see we're all here and all ready to go, Stephen and Paul. Now, what I'm going to do is, if you've read the promotional material for this webinar, we're going to cover what we hope are some of the key issues that are forming in IT security this year. And I'm sure anybody on the webinar is quite au fait with some of the bigger issues around, and data breaches and identity theft. But what we're hoping to do today is give for general listeners with an interest in this area, professionals in the space, but also business owners, business professionals and executives who we know we have a wide audience of these people, and they are interested in the key issues facing IT security and how they can protect both their business and indeed at its most severe protect their own careers from what is a remarkable, I would imagine it is a remarkable period in the history of the IT industry, and certainly over the last decade, the sheer pace and severity of IT security attacks is changing the very nature of this business. So first, I'm going to introduce Stephen Wilson, as I said, Managing Director of Lockstep Group, and he's going to give us a short presentation. Stephen, if you'd like to begin.
Many thanks, James, and thanks for the invitation to participate. I wanted to just say a few things about cloud and a few things about identity. I think cloud is certainly the topic du jour in IT, isn't it? It's a metaphor. The cloud idea has its roots in network diagrams 10 or 20 years ago, when engineers would depict public networks with a sort of a vague cloud symbol. And what they were trying to get at was that it doesn't really matter how your data gets from A to B, as long as it arrives safely and with certainty. Now, the metaphor has taken off like so many things in IT. It's really now got a life of its own. And we're at an interesting point in the cycle where I would just recommend that a lot of people sit back and make themselves a nice cup of tea and think carefully about what it is that they expect the cloud to deliver. I'm not here to define cloud computing because I think we've all got a handle on it, but my mission today is to just remind people of what the cloud might be and to start making sure that we ask some critical questions. So I personally think that 90% of cloud is best thought of as outsourcing, because there's a lot of pragmatic issues that I'm sure we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes. But of course, the real paradigm shift with cloud is that it does provide opportunities for you to leverage other people's superior infrastructure. And so certainly the sheer computing grunt that we see from the Amazon cloud service is important. And things like cloud services from Salesforce allow you to, in fact, take advantage of applications that you might not have otherwise ever used in your business. One of the advantages of cloud is efficiency, of course. We're going to save money, at least on fat client software licenses. there are a lot of claims being made that we might be able to save money on our IT budgets and our IT departments. I would really caution that people have modest expectations. We're not going to fire our IT people overnight. There's just too many complicated questions to ask first. So you need to retain your own expertise for a while. An example is compliance. Privacy regulations affect the location of your cloud. Incidentally, when you survey CIOs, the very first thing they ask about, or the first concern they raise in cloud computing is a desperate need to know exactly where their data is being held. And so that strikes me as being a bit paradoxical. We'd like to think that the cloud is vague and deliberately ambiguous. Worry about these things anymore, but we're just not ready for it. You do need to worry about privacy compliance. You do need to worry about law enforcement, because in some places, especially the US, there's abundant precedent now where law enforcement are exercising their rights under Homeland Security law to go directly into the databases of large IT companies. And if you're a client of one of those IT companies, you need to be prepared for the ramifications of legal discovery on your client data. All of this comes back to SLAs. You need to read those SLAs. I think you need to ignore the people that are saying SLAs don't matter in the cloud, because that claim is being made every now and again. They certainly do matter, if only because you want to know about business continuity. A lot of people are probably familiar with the problem that that Flickr had recently, and indeed with Amazon, where they went offline for a period of time. And it was not clear to a lot of clients what the state of their data was when they all came back. Access control is the final point I'd make about cloud, is simply if your data is out in the cloud and you're accessing it remotely, then in principle lots of other people are accessing your data remotely. And we're certainly seeing the issue of endpoint device security, namely your iPhones and your iPads and your PCs and your internet cafe points being really, really important in terms of how do you access control in the data in the cloud. So that brings me to identity, which is such a fabulous and rich area in IT at the moment. Again, it's rich with definitions and ambiguity, and I'm simply here to say that we need to be really crystal clear about identity. We know what identity means in the real world. It means how do you know people, how do they know you, and on the internet the issue is what do you need to know about somebody in order to do business with them. I've just tried to diagram there 5 or 6 sort of competing forces, if you like, that are tugging on the identity problem in different directions. Identity management means efficiency. In fact, anything on the internet really means efficiently. We're trying to get paper out of our business, we're trying to improve transaction speed, and we're trying to reach more clients more efficiently. We're trying to originate more clients. Maybe we're trying to, in fact, open bank accounts for people who we've never met before. This is what the European banks are doing when they open virtual branches in Australia under the new financial transactions legislation. We're trying to compete with the fraudsters. We're trying to eliminate fraud. We're trying to cut cyber crime. We're trying to keep up with that arms race. We want accessibility for our telecommuters and for our international clients. We want mobility. We want to use our iPads and our iPhones and our, don't forget our good old Blackberry. It brings up the topic of NFC, new wireless devices to access the cloud. At the end of the day, we're hoping for an enormous amount of business transformation, which will be enabled by better identity management. And of course, let's not forget privacy. So just quickly to touch on a few things that I think we're going to see a lot of in the next 12 months, and we could take questions about any of these. Smartphones, I've mentioned a couple of times already. Some people believe that the smartphone will be your wallet, and of course Google has just launched something which is exactly called the Google Wallet. The idea that you'll be able to embed into your phone a number of credit cards and use those at terminals and over the net. And identity of that system is obviously crucial. We might even take the next step one day of putting your actual identities, your driver's license and your passport and God knows what else on your smartphone. Federated identity is the idea that once you have an identity with one provider, like Facebook, gee, wouldn't it be good if you could use that Facebook identity to log onto other services? So federation is an easily stated ambition. I've just given it to you in one sentence. It proves to be fiendishly difficult to realise in practice for banks and governments. So we might have Facebook ID, and we're soon going to have LinkedIn ID, which is going to be a fabulous new form of social identity. The way that these things ratchet up into banking and e-government is a hot topic for debate. So far, federating has proved easier said than done, but I think in the next 12 months we're going to see a lot of innovation in that area and a lot of business value. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's very interesting and very pragmatic, and I have been taking notes throughout, and I see some questions coming in on that. And remember, everybody, that we will have this Q&A session immediately after our next speaker's presentation. And our next speaker is Paul Ducklin, Head of Technology at the Asia Pacific region for Sophos. Paul, if you'd like to begin, and we'd like to hear what you have to say, and then we'll be ready to take some questions.
Excellent. Can everybody hear me okay? The nice thing about doing webinars is you have to assume the audience is listening. So here we go. My first slide is just the, if you like, the only bit of sales stuff that I have in the presentation, to give you my name, to give you a website which you can go to for day-by-day news, opinion, advice and research on computer security issues. That's nakedsecurity.sophos.com. And to those of you who listening who have TweetDeck in the background, and I know there are some of you, you can follow me on Twitter @duckblog. So for those of you who don't know, Sophos is a computer security company. That's the simplest way of putting it. It's such a simple way of putting it. It's what we put on our building in North Sydney. And I put that little building is actually one of our 3 main research labs around the world, where our guys spend the time trying to understand what cyber crooks are doing. And one of the interesting things that we see in the lab is the sheer scale of the problem, because the cyber crooks are making so much money out of it. So we're processing about 100,000 new malware samples per day. And just to put that in perspective, the first 6 years that I was involved in antivirus research, which was from the mid to late 80s to early 90s, the first 6 years we saw 10,000 distinct new items of malware. Now we see 100,000 per day, mainly because the bad guys are making so much money out of this that it actually pays them to invest in creating, if you like, a new item of malware for each person who visits their malicious or infectious website. And the next statistic, if we can go to the next slide, that the guys see in the lab, and this should give you pause for reflection if you are concerned by the recent news about data breaches about companies like Epsilon, Honda, the state of Texas, the state of Massachusetts, Sony, etc., etc. Our labs guys are coming across approximately 30,000 newly infected web pages per day. Now, that means that ones that have been infected before we're not even counting. And the issue with this is almost all of those, the very vast majority, probably 99% of those, are actually hosted on otherwise innocent sites. In other words, almost every bad web page we see constitutes in some small way a data breach. Somebody has got control over your site or a page on your site in order to trick it into taking your visitors somewhere that they shouldn't go. So if we can go to the next slide. The most important thing to remember is this is not just something that belongs to the Windows era. Now, a lot of people who use Linux perhaps on their servers, Mac at home, who have mobile devices which tend to work in what's called a walled garden. If you have an Apple iPhone, you have to shop at the App Store, you're probably locked into a particular mobile carrier, and it all seems like a sealed environment where nothing can go wrong. But actually, the whole issue of data data getting into the wrong places, cyber crooks getting where they ought not, is actually a problem for everybody. Here's an example. This is a map. This is admittedly from a couple of years ago, but it just shows this is at a time when Linux users really had their heads in the sand about malicious software and attacks on their websites, even though the vast majority of web servers in the world probably running, not the vast majority, but a significant majority are probably running Linux and not Windows. This is a map of infected Linux clients and servers in Europe, infected with a virus that at the time we made that map was already spread without user intervention. So imagine on any one of those sites, security was obviously not taken seriously enough, and you can easily imagine that any one of those sites, if it was a web server, is exactly the kind of place that the bad guys would love to jump in and use as a starting point for their cyber crookery. Also, Mac users as well, Apple users. Recently, the cyber crooks have noticed that they can make money out of Mac users as well. So the sympathetic magic that many Apple users seem to believe protects them, in that somehow Steve Jobs has told them that their computer will be free of malicious software forever by design. The bad guys finally, and we saw 3 new variants of this just this morning, the bad guys are finally bringing what we call fake antivirus or scareware to Mac users. The idea is it finds non-existent threats on your computer, scares you into giving up your credit card number, you spend $69, and once you spent the money, well, guess what? The threats magically appear to disappear from your computer. So the bad guys are learning to get into more than just Windows computers and Windows users these days. So much for data breaches. Part of that is our behavior, that perhaps we don't take cybersecurity and cybersecurity awareness as keenly and we don't treat it as importantly as we should. Of course, unfortunately, things are probably going to get worse before they get better, and one of the reasons that Stephen alluded to very eloquently is this proliferation of mobile devices, which are increasingly almost as powerful as the computer you use at the desktop, and increasingly people are using them for the same things. So just to give you an idea of how mobile devices are in the bad guy's scope, that's a set of devices from left to right. I think we've got an iPhone, a Blueberry, we've got a Google Android device, and we've got the latest incarnation of Windows Mobile, now imaginatively called Windows Phone. That's their mobile version of their operating system. At a recent security conference in Canada, the 2 on the left, that's the iPhone and the Blackberry, were actually owned via taking people to a malicious website for competitive purposes. The other two actually survived that determined attack by, if you like, paid hackers. If we go to the next slide, you'll notice that what I've actually done is I've sort of marked Android off as well. Even though it survived the attack at this particular conference, there's been quite a burst of malicious software for the Google phone, for Android operating system, probably because there's a lot more diversity there. So data breaches are something that we live with every day because in many cases the bad guys are able to walk through our defenses, whether we're a cloud provider or whether we're running our own servers or whether we're trusting an outsourcer, and the sheer scale of the problem suggests that. And perhaps we are not making enough time for cybersecurity or for cybersecurity awareness. Some of you will probably know or may know that last week was federal government's Cybersecurity Awareness Week, and one of the interesting things about Cybersecurity Awareness Week is how low awareness was about it. So what we need to do collectively is make that time for being aware about cybersecurity, and if we do that, then we shall surely begin to win the battle against the bad guys.
Thank you, Paul. And thank you for that presentation. It covers quite a lot of ground, and I see the questions rolling in. One of the questions, by the way, on the screen is somebody has asked, Paul Calabac has asked about, he asks, what is the Blueberry? Well, the Blueberry is actually, it doesn't exist. I think we were, of course, talking about the Blackberry. Sorry about that. Now, just bringing across the issue of the cloud, I think that's the first big issue I want to talk about, and I can see most questions are on that, certainly the early ones in Charis. I might bring you in here for a moment. And I just want to ask you, as somebody who's worked in this area, whether the issue always with cloud is this mixture of opportunity balanced by a certain fear factor, and I'm just wondering, from your perception in the market, is it getting any better in relation to cloud? Is the sense of security improving, or is it in flux?
I think there's still a lot of people trying to get their head around what cloud means for their business, and I really like the way that Stephen referred to it in terms of, you know, let's just call it what it is, which is essentially outsourcing. And if we called it outsourcing, that would probably change people's thinking from the very beginning as to the security implications of that, because obviously as a company you wouldn't hand over data to a third-party company without doing some pretty strong and high-level kind of due diligence around the company that you're choosing to partner with. So I think that I think we're only at the beginning of companies kind of, there's big companies that are and have invested in exploring cloud and have made decisions around it. We're seeing some banks move towards sort of hosted clouds or internal clouds is what they sometimes call them, and essentially I guess it's kind of cloud de-risked to the point where they're happy to deal with it. But of course, again, banks have also been slapped on the wrist a little bit in some cases where they've moved to outsource some things to the cloud, and regulators have shown some concern about that and have, I guess, flagged some items in terms of where data sits, and those are sorts of the discussions that we're having at a high level corporate environment sort of stage. Of course, the most attractive thing in terms of the cloud is that it actually is available to any sized company, and because obviously the implication is that small to medium-sized businesses will embrace the cloud and are embracing the cloud because they understand it from an individual point of view and they want to apply it to their company. And the question then becomes, what are the risks?
Okay, thank you, Charis. I might just ask back to Stephen. There's a good question here from a Barry Williams, and he's obviously has a certain element of skepticism when he says that in relation to cloud and cloud security, he says when you ask them to provide uncapped liabilities for breach of performance, he says they immediately place significantly low cap or lower cap on those responsibilities. I don't know if that's always the case, Stephen, but could you explain perhaps the realities of the security side? Are there actual quantifiable differences in relation to liabilities when you are using cloud for any company?
I look forward, sure, James. A lot of people may recall the Flickr experience, which from memory is about 12 months back. But Flickr, of course, the immensely popular photo sharing site that's been around for many, many years. And I guess what slipped under people's radar screens was that professional photographers had started to use Flickr in a serious way. Now, the Flickr is free for most people, but there was a professional package, which I must say I don't know a lot about, but an important photographer used Flickr on a professional account and suffered an outage where some tens of thousands of the bloke's photos were lost. And, you might be wise after the fact, and I certainly am glad I'm not in his shoes, but he only checked his service level agreements after the fact and found that Flickr had disclaimed all liability for what turned out to be his professional livelihood. Now, it just is a very dramatic illustration of the importance of any service level agreement, and let's pair this back to basics again. Any contract, I think, when your business hinges on it, bears a lot of scrutiny. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm afraid that I have to recommend to my clients that they do engage lawyers and have a really close look at those service level agreements. If liability is important to you, then indeed you need to grill the provider. What distresses me, and I hope it's plain that I'm not here to defend the cloud or to champion it. I'm a keen observer on all things clouding. What is obvious when you talk to people about the fine print, that some vendors are saying, look, if you're really worried about redundancy, you should keep your own. Is paradoxical, because most people got into the cloud in the first place to actually use cloud services as their backup. So when a cloud provider like Amazon says to you, look, hey guys, I hope you're keeping your own backups, I think that really underscores that what we're talking about here is a new alternative computer service, and there's no magic to it. And if we really...
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah. It's actually quite interesting, and I want to just, if I can, stay with me, because I want to just bridge, if you like, over to another question which has come in, and it's in the same area, and I might ask Paul to pick this up. It's from Kieran, and he asks about cloud computing. Does it mean the end of centralized hardware beyond desktop and mobile devices. Just gathering from what Stephen is saying, Paul, obviously no system is perfect and no innovation that comes along in IT is perfect, and maybe this is what we're hearing between the lines here. But would you take this question, Paul, as to whether it does mean the end of centralized hardware?
I think cloud computing, in terms of what the pure play cloud providers, the Googles, the Gmails, the Amazons, the Hotmails, etc., it means exactly the opposite. It is the utter and absolute centralization of computing resources in jurisdictions you don't control, that you cannot predict in advance, held and managed by people under conditions which may change over time. So, in other words, if you want to be concerned about stuff relating to the cloud, it is, if you've ever gone into any sort of cloud providers server rooms or network operation centers, if you can actually find out where they are, because many of them are top secret, you will see something which just looks like a mainframe to the power of a mainframe, just server after server after server after server. So it seems that what the cloud is bringing us together with some sort of distribution of servers in cloud service providers around the world, it is actually based upon centralization. And that may not be physical centralization, it's a centralization of trust, where you just assume that your provider is actually going to do the right thing. By the way, that story that Stephen told about Flickr, it's actually much worse than he projected it. I think he was being kind. Flickr didn't just lose that guy's data. He complained because some other user was ripping off his intellectual property. Flickr investigated, apparently, allegedly, found out that he was correct and set about deleting the other guy's account, except they deleted his account by mistake. And when he said, "I'd like my data back," they told him, "Oh, terribly sorry, we can't do that." And only when he brought the big guns to bear on them did they magically discover, well, they could bring it back after all. Apparently got 40 years to a restaurant that gave you food poisoning and complaining, and they say, "Oh, we'll give you 5 free meals." So I think that the problem with that centralization in the cloud is that it's centralization that goes beyond, in many cases, beyond your control. And all you're left with is a piece of paper that says, here's what you'll get back if we mess up. And you need to be very careful, because in many cases those guarantees and promises may be worth only about as much as the paper they're written on.
Thank you, Paul. That's interesting, and I expect any new area will always have an element of excitement around it, of course, and the sense of possibility and reality dawns as we start to use it more, and these sort of stories emerge. Charis Palmer of Technology Spectator. One of the questions that's come in, which is not on cloud, but it's probably a question, I imagine, that it's very general in nature. It's from Paul, and he asked, but isn't the primary issue in IT security risk still from employees and insiders? Is there any sense, first of all, whether that is actually sort of fundamental truth in IT security, Charis, and has it changed in any fashion with the arrival of cloud?
Look, I mean, all of the research reports that we see always point to the fact that the vast majority of fraud that's perpetrated, particularly inside big companies, is done by staff. And of course, inherently that's problematic, because there's not always an onus on a corporation to reveal that fraud, particularly when it's done by one of their own. So there's always a conflict there, but nevertheless, so in fact, if anything, you'd say there's probably more of that going on than what we hear about. So yes, that continues to be the case. I guess the link between cloud and what is happening there is that it's obviously a lot easier now for people to export data outside of a company and to have that data stored somewhere, whether that be anonymously or not. So, the ways that people can get information out of the company, continue to grow every year, and I think that is the bigger risk. That the motivations for fraud is what needs to be addressed in those cases, as opposed to the technology itself, because we're only going to be given more opportunities for people to do that. The question is why they're doing it in the first place, but that's probably a topic for another day about psychology.
Okay, thank you, Charis. Look, what I want to do is I might just now quickly ask both of you, Paul and Stephen, if you could just give a relatively short answer to this question. Maybe there is no short answer, but you have to attempt. It's from Joanne. She asks, we're going to talk about devices for a moment. Let's talk about phones and mobile devices. We said we would in this seminar. She asks, what security software should we use on our mobile phones? Interesting, in your presentation you said things might get worse before they get better. I wonder, is there any sense whatsoever that things are ever going to get better? There is a sense of it of almost drowning in security issues abroad at the moment with this multiplicity of devices. But is there a single answer to that, or is there anything like an answer to that question?
That's a very tough one, to be honest. One of the problems with the modern wave of mobile devices, iPhone very particularly and Android slightly less so, is that they're almost the ultimate cloud devices. You can only use the cloud. You are usually locked into a particular mobile phone provider. You can only access applications that are approved and blessed by the person who's sold you the device. Say if you have an Apple iPhone or an iPad, you can only download them from there and pay money through their special shop. And most importantly, if you're a developer, you can only develop for that walled garden that your application will work in. So one of the things that actually worries me a lot, and I hope that Apple will learn to change their mind, is that it's very hard for innovative third-party security companies to build properly secure applications for devices like the iPhone. And even the Apple Mac these days, if you sell an application through the Apple's App Store, you are prevented from doing a whole load of things in that application which would make it useful from a security point of view. For example, you can't have what's called a kernel driver, so you can't add any security that prevents things from happening in advance. Exactly the same follows for the iPhone. So in a way, the issue is what security software should you use on a mobile device these days. Unfortunately, you don't have much choice, and you're relying on the person who made the thing in the first place and sold it to you under the premise that it was secure. You're relying on them doing most of the innovation. Having said that, there are tools that there are tools which let you, and I'd say that because Sophos happens to have one, which let you manage mobile devices within the context of what the vendor of that device wants you to do, that at least make sure that your employees, if they bring their own devices to the organization, that they meet some minimum security standards that let you deal with things like password security, password change policies, and things like how to remotely wipe the device if they lose it. So it's these days more about controlling the devices from a central point than actually being able to put software on the device that locks them down like you might be used to doing with a PC.
Okay, thank you for that, Paul. Look, I'm just going to keep on this subject because there is a question which is very much the sort of question I imagined we'd get in a seminar like this, and perhaps it typifies what a lot of our listeners might be thinking there today. It's from Joe. He says, and I'll read this question out in full, it's very interesting. It says, question is, how should a corporate be prepared for, and how should you think corporates should police different mobile platforms? And then he says, interestingly at the end of it, I have been involved in a security audit. Stephen, you might just pick that up. I think the key question there was about thinking. How does corporates or companies of any size, how do they prepare strategically for policing these multiplicity of mobile platforms that are emerging?
Look, it's a hot issue, and it goes back to the caution I had before, which is, for God's sake, nobody think about scaling back their IT departments at this point in the cycle, because there's a lot of internal questions that need to be raised before anybody can move forward with a lot of confidence here. I think that corporates need to engage at the policy level with the cloud providers, because the question is, as Paul said, responsibility for the quality and the security of applications mainly vests with the providers. And of course there are dramatically different approaches. You only look at iStore versus the Android marketplace to see a very, very heavy-handed sort of nanny-state approach of Apple's versus Google's more laissez-faire approach. And needless to say, there are dramatic pros and cons in both cases. it seems to me that not a week goes by without a banking-related application being withdrawn from the Android marketplace over fears that that these things are Trojan horses for malware. If I was a corporate IT person, I would be really trying to engage at quite a high level with the compliance and governance people at the cloud providers, and trying to understand what the quality life cycle is that they go through, what are the assurance and the testing processes that they submit these applications to, and again to get back to that SLA, because you're on the horns of a dilemma. If you are inclined to open up your network so that your staff can bring their own devices in, then there's some pretty heavy questions about who's going to be responsible for the adverse outcomes. So there's no easy answer to that one, but again, it's really an important one. You need to have some solid IT people and some lawyers.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I'm going to just, I can see the questions, if you like, are bunching in groups around various issues, and to some extent I'll use one that sort of typifies the nature of these questions. We did say that we would talk about social media, and Charis, I know you're very interested in that area and using it very well as a journalist at the moment. Anita has particular questions I can also see on the screen, but Anita asks, can you talk more about the potential fraud for individuals and companies through LinkedIn usage and profiles? I'll just begin on this with Charis, and you might be able to summarize for us if this seems to be an issue emerging globally at the moment. I certainly haven't read too much about LinkedIn itself.
Well, look, there's been some recent discussions around it. I guess it's a fact that because of LinkedIn so popular, I mean, in Australia we have 2 million users now, so and it's rapidly growing every day. So essentially LinkedIn, is a socially kind of connected recruitment site, if you like, and a big part of the usage of LinkedIn and the way that LinkedIn makes its money is by, its job services essentially. And so we see a lot of recruiters and a lot of job hunters using LinkedIn in that way. I guess the question is, and it comes back to any site, is, how do you prove that those people are who they say they are? And likewise, given that LinkedIn is so sort of socially or social media enabled, what's the veracity of the claims made by people on your LinkedIn page about you, and how much would a recruiter believe that? And it's kind of like saying, well, all of my friends endorse me, so obviously, you should hire me. But that's obviously not a traditional way of recruiting. Checks and balances are done in other ways. So, look, I wouldn't say I'm hugely familiar with the security practices that LinkedIn have put in place, but obviously it would be detrimental for their business if they had a broad-scale problem with this going on that they didn't then address. And a lot of it comes back to, I guess, typical social engineering type frauds that can happen, which can happen on any social media platform where people are duped into giving information out, or where information that's provided is later proved to not be true. It's really a case of, take everything with a grain of salt.
Okay, I'm hoping I'm right here. I think it was Paul who mentioned in the course of their presentation about the notion of federated ID. In any case, I'd like both of you again to answer this question, and if you can answer it quickly. No, my producer reminds me that it was Stephen, so Stephen, we'll ask you first. But here's the question. It's from Anthony, and it's about that. It's exactly about that federated ID. How is my digital ID protected if you're using a federated ID such as LinkedIn? Is it protected in the first place, Stephen?
Well, it depends on what we mean by protected, and I don't know whether we can engage in a bit of feedback, Anthony, but there's two things. One, the process of getting an identity represents somebody vouchsafing maybe your affiliations and so on. So the quality of an identity depends on what hoops you jump through. The other protection that we're interested in is once you've got an identity, can anybody else take it over or usurp it or steal it as they can with passwords and so on? Look, if we can't get any further feedback on Anthony's interest area, I could proceed.
Yeah, no, we can't, no, sorry.
Look, that's okay. I assume that we're probably talking about protection against identity theft, which is the second class I was talking about. LinkedIn and Facebook identities at this point are of course single factor. They're your handle and your password. And these things are susceptible to theft. As we saw at Sony, where millions of PlayStation Network users have been compromised, we are getting more and more confirmation that people's passwords are easily stolen, and they tend to reuse the same password. So I would strongly recommend anybody using Facebook or LinkedIn to take care with their password and use an absolutely unique one for those networks. Going forward, we know that the providers are sensitive to identity theft, and many of them are implementing two-factor authentication, often using mobile handsets to confirm an SMS code. Google are doing this, and we expect that Facebook will follow suit. I tend to think that LinkedIn will be one of the most successful social identities, because a lot of care and a lot of feedback loops, quality feedback loops go into your Facebook identity, your LinkedIn identity. It tends to be real as opposed to Facebook, which tends to be a pseudonym or an avatar. I think LinkedIn is going to be very successful commercially with their identity system, and I predict that they're going to implement two-factor authentication as well.
Okay, I might interrupt there, Stephen, if I could. We have very short time left. Paul, do you agree that LinkedIn would appear to be the safest, if you like, in relation to identity of these key social networks from an IT perspective?
Well, I can't really comment on the back-end security of LinkedIn any more than I can comment on the back-end security of Gmail, Hotmail, Facebook or whatever. And that's one big problem with the cloud. You can't actually go and look at it and see how it works because it is so broadly distributed and operated by somebody else. But in terms of risk to business from social media, I actually have come to the conclusion, and it's just an opinion, that LinkedIn is much more dangerous than Facebook. And the reason for that is that on Facebook, people are learning to perhaps go in with a pseudonym and share limited amounts of information, the kind of stuff that they might share with someone they've just met in the pub. On LinkedIn, a significant minority, at least, of people are actually going there to tell the truth. They don't want to put up a fake in the future. They want to be proud of their achievements. And that is an absolute goldmine for social engineers. And advanced fee fraud and scams of that sort are costing Australia, it must be several $100 millions per year. That's just people being scammed by those who seem to know them better than they do. And of course, the place where the cyber crooks start for that sort of scam is your social networking persona. Information that we seem overly willing and overly open in trusting to other people.
Okay, thank you. And I might just add, finally, we didn't get to talk about data breaches. It's something that I would like to have covered. And Charis, we might just, in conclusion, come round to you and ask about this, as there's a variety of questions on the screen about data breaches, but they mostly seem to coalesce, if you like, into an issue about which of the banks would seem to be most under pressure on this issue. I've actually different names used. Would you be able to give us a summary of that issue just for all our listeners?
Sure. Well, look, I think banks, rightly or wrongly, take a lot of the heat around what's happening with data breaches. Often those data breaches are happening at a merchant level. So it's the merchant who they provide a merchant facility or a facility to allow them to take credit cards, but that is the organisation that's actually being breached as opposed to the bank. And of course, by default, the bank takes the heat because they've allowed that merchant to be a customer of theirs. And then the bank has to have some I guess, confidence that that merchant is storing credit card information securely. That's why we have the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. The issue with that, and I know Stephen could talk at length on this, is that not all merchants are compliant with that, and even those that are compliant, they're still being breached. And so we have a standard that really isn't delivering any value, in a sense that we're not seeing a decline in these sorts of breaches, we're actually seeing them continue. There's evidence that there's a decline in breaches in those organisations that are compliant, but there's still quite a large percentage of organisations that are compliant that still have breaches. So I think, you know, in terms of those merchant level breaches, we'll continue to see them happen until there's some sort of further liability shift, and I guess as sort of mid-level organisations become bigger targets, or are seen to be easy targets for hackers, will have to see a strengthening of security at that level of organisation. And their ticket to be in business means that they have to invest in IT security. Some of these businesses are not doing that, and that really shows in terms of the number of breaches we're seeing.
Okay, thank you, Charis, and that certainly illustrated to me the issue, of course, that as you say, the banks, even with their tremendous resources and their assets in this area, they can't ring-fence themselves because they must deal with questions are, I imagine, widely varying in standards, and of course this is what's coming back to bite them. Well, look, thank you very much, everybody. We're just about running out of time. I would like to say, as we wrap up today's webinar, I'd like to thank our panelists, Stephen Wilson, Managing Director of the Lockstep Group, Paul Ducklin, Head of Technology, Asia Pacific Region at Sophos, and Charis Palmer from Technology Spectator, and our sponsors who make this event possible, GoToMeeting by Citrix. Also, thanks to you for attending and your involvement in today's event. We do appreciate it. Please take the opportunity to provide us with direct feedback about today. We've had lots of questions from you, but send us some topics you might like to see covered in the future. If you'd like us to do this session again, perhaps, you will be sent a link to this recording tomorrow, and we hope to see you again at another of these interactive sessions. Thank you very much, and goodbye.